At 2 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a Colorado winter, a 32-year-old widow woke up to the sound of her son trying not to cough. He was 8 years old. His lungs were failing. He had buried his face in a wool blanket, so he wouldn't wake his little sister. The mother crossed the room in bare feet. The fire was still burning. The thermometer on the wall read 45 degrees. 45 degrees. Inside. With a fire. She already knew what that meant. This cabin was not going to hold December. Her husband had been dead for 8 months. The whole town said it was an accident on the mountain. Falling rock. Bad luck. They buried him and they moved on. The town also said other things about her. Behind her back at the general store. From the pulpit on Sunday. Around the fire at the trading post. Foolish. Stubborn. A woman who wouldn't know when to give up. But under a loose floorboard, her husband had left something behind. A leather notebook. Measurements written in his own hand. And on the last page, 3 words she couldn't stop reading. Do not tell. If you've ever been the one nobody believed. If you've ever kept working while the whole town laughed. Stay with her tonight. Because what this widow was about to build in the side of a Colorado mountain was going to save more lives than the people who mocked her ever deserved. 2 o'clock in the morning. Silverpine Basin, Colorado. Autumn 1884. Ida Renshaw opened her eyes because her son was trying not to cough. He was 8 years old. His name was Wesley. He had pressed his face into a wool blanket so he wouldn't wake his little sister. Ida heard him anyway. She always did. She sat up. The cabin floor bit her feet. Cold through the pine boards. Cold up her ankles. Cold that had no business being there in October. Because the fire was still going. Because she could see the red coals from where she sat. Because a fire that big should have kept the room at 50 degrees at least. She crossed to the wall. Lifted the lantern. Read the thermometer. 45. Inside. With flames in the hearth. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the number, then at Wesley, then at Prudence, 5 years old, curled around her rag doll. A scrap cotton thing named Buttons, sleeping so deep she looked already gone somewhere. Ida had a thought she did not want. If it's 45 in October, then December, then Wesley. She stopped that thought before it finished. But it had already started. Wesley coughed again. Small. Wet. He didn't wake all the way. He just made a sound like a kitten drowning in a jar. And Ida crossed the room in 3 strides and put her hand on his back until it stopped. His shirt was damp. She lifted him gently, wrapped a second blanket around his ribs, sat with him against her chest for a while. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines. Not hard, not yet, just steady, just enough to say what was coming. Ida looked at the door. Elias's coat was still hanging on the peg beside it. 8 months. He had been dead for 8 months. She still hadn't taken the coat down. Elias Renshaw had been a stonemason, and a prospector, and a quiet man who read the mountain the way other men read newspapers. They had come out to Colorado in '79 because Elias said there was silver in the Rockies, and time was short. He wasn't wrong about the silver. He was wrong about the time. In January, on the 5th day of a hard freeze, 3 men came to the cabin door and stood there with their hats off. Ida knew before they said the word. Rockfall. That was the word. The mountain took him. That was how they said it. Like the mountain had chosen. Like it had reached down and picked him up the way a child picks a stone. They buried him on the ridge above the creek. Ida wore his coat to the funeral because she didn't own one warm enough. She hadn't been able to take it off after. Now she sat with Wesley, listened to him breathe, watched the fire, and did the math she had been trying not to do. She counted the pile outside the door in her head, maybe 5 weeks of firewood. 6 if she was careful. December alone was 5. January was worse. She had 1 milk cow, Marigold, in the lean-to, still giving. She had a smokehouse with 1 deer. She had 40 pounds of flour. She had 2 children. And she had a cabin whose walls she could see daylight through in 3 separate places, if the sun was low. That was what she had. She looked at Wesley in her arms, and she said something inside her head that she did not say out loud. "We're not going to make it." She said it clean. She said it flat. Not to scare herself. To know it. Because knowing was the first thing. Her father had taught her that. Back east. Before she came out to marry Elias. Her father had been a professor of engineering at a small college in Massachusetts, and he had told her once, sitting on the porch watching a summer storm build, "Don't panic, Ida. Just tell yourself what's true." "Well, Papa, here's what's true. We are going to freeze. Unless something changes." Ida closed her eyes. Wesley shifted against her, small and warm, and she could feel the way his breath caught every third or fourth pull. That little hitch. Doc Ellsworth had told her, quietly, out on the porch, that hitch was not going to go away. "Keep him warm, Mrs. Renshaw." That was what the doctor had said. Ida had asked him how warm. Doc Ellsworth had looked at the gaps between the logs. And then he had looked at his boots. He hadn't answered. Later, she carried Wesley back to bed. She lay down beside Prudence and the rag doll. She did not sleep. She listened to the wind. She thought about her father. She thought about her mother, who had died the summer Ida turned 19, right before Ida married Elias, and boarded a train to Denver. She thought about the things you inherit. Some people inherit money. Some people inherit land. Some people inherit last names that open doors. Ida had inherited 2 things. One was a stubbornness that her father, laughing, once said would kill her someday. The other was the way he had taught her to think about heat. Her father used to sketch on brown paper on the kitchen table. Walls, chimneys, foundations, air channels. She had watched him for hours, as a girl, chin on her palms. He had one rule. He said it so many times it sounded like a song. "Don't ask what feels warm. Ask where the heat goes." That was the whole thing. That was the whole trick. Most fires, most stoves, most fireplaces, they sent their heat up the chimney and out into the night. The house got a lick of warmth, and the sky got the rest. Papa used to say the sky was the richest man in the country, because everybody was heating it for free. Ida had laughed at that once. She wasn't laughing now, because her cabin was heating the sky, and there was a boy under her arm who could not afford that. Morning came slow and gray. She fed the children oatmeal with a spoonful of molasses each. Prudence sang to Buttons. Wesley ate quietly and watched his mother. He was a watchful boy. He always had been. After his father died, he had gotten quieter, not louder, and that had scared Ida in a way she couldn't put words to. "Are you cold, Mama?" he asked. "No," she said, which was a lie. Which he knew. He didn't say so. She scrubbed the bowls. She put on Elias's coat. She stepped out to check the woodpile again, as if it might have grown overnight. It hadn't. She was still standing there, doing the math for the 3rd time when Cyrus Blackwood rode up. Cyrus Blackwood owned the ranch at the mouth of the basin. He owned the general store. He owned 2 of the mines. He owned enough of Silverpine that when he came into a room, the room shifted a little toward him without meaning to. He was 52 years old, silver at the temples, face carved like a saddle, expensive, well-oiled, used to sitting on top of something. He wore a good gray coat. He rode a bay gelding with a silver-tipped bridle. He was, everyone in Silverpine agreed, a gentleman. Ida did not agree, but she had never said so. Yet, he tipped his hat. "Mrs. Renshaw, Mr. Blackwood, cold morning." "It is." He looked at the cabin, at the sagging roofline, at the smoke coming out of the chimney too fast, the smoke of a fire that wasn't warming the house it was leaving. Ida watched him look. She knew what he was seeing. She knew what he wanted her to know he was seeing. "Mrs. Renshaw," he said, gentle as a preacher at a bedside. "I've been thinking about you." "Have you?" "I have. About your situation. About those children. Kind of you. May I speak plainly?" "You always do." He smiled. A small, sad smile. The kind of smile a man makes When he's about to say something he wants you to think he doesn't want to say. Ida, he said. She noted the first name. She noted it and filed it away. Ida, I don't think you should be here this winter. Not with a sick boy, not alone. She said nothing. I could take the parcel off your hands. Fair price. Enough to put you and the little ones on a train to your people in the east. A boarding house, a doctor for the boy, a better school for the girl. Ida looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. She thought, he has practiced this speech. She thought, he thinks I am about to cry. She thought, he does not know me at all. She said, no. That was all she said. Cyrus Blackwood blinked. I beg your pardon. You heard me, Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Renshaw. Ida. I'm offering you. I heard what you offered. Silence. Just the wind. Just the horse breathing. Cyrus rearranged his face. He put on a slightly different smile. Sadder. More patient. The smile of a man dealing with a woman who was, unfortunately, not being reasonable. Winter has a way of changing minds, he said. So does spring, Ida said. He looked at her. He looked at her a beat too long. Then he tipped his hat. Good day, Mrs. Renshaw. Good day, Mr. Blackwood. He rode off. Ida stood in the cold, with her arms wrapped around herself. And in her head very clearly, she thought, he was too polite, which meant he already knew he was going to win, which meant he had a plan, which meant she was about to have a very bad autumn. Sunday came. Sunday always came. The Silverpine Church was a small clapboard building at the top of the wagon road. White paint peeling. Bell in a pine post tower. A dozen wagons on Sunday mornings. Sometimes 15. Ida sat in the back row with Wesley on one side and Prudence on the other. Prudence was holding buttons. Wesley was holding himself together. Reverend Wickham took the pulpit. Reverend Wickham was a tall man. Late 40s. Long face. A voice that could carry across the basin without effort. His sermons were, most Sundays, harmless. Hard work. Honest labor. The Lord's provision. Amen. Amen. That Sunday his sermon was not harmless. He did not name her. He didn't have to. There is a certain kind of pride, brethren, that the Lord has never blessed. Prudence looked up at her mother. The pride of a woman who forgets the order the Lord set. The pride of a woman who will not take a hand offered in kindness. The pride of a woman who tries to do what her hands were not made for. Ida did not move. The Lord, in His mercy, sometimes sends winter to teach what summer would not. And sometimes He allows a lesson to fall not just on the proud, but on the little ones who depend on her. Prudence's hand tightened in her mother's. Wesley did not look up. The Reverend went on for another 20 minutes. He never said the word widow. He never said the word Renshaw. But when they walked out of the church into the cold sunshine, 3 women who had known Ida for 4 years walked past her, without meeting her eyes. Only one person spoke to her that day. Hattie Doyle. 68 years old. A widow herself. 2 miles down the west road. Face like a piece of hard bread, no softness, no cruelty either. She stopped in front of Ida at the church steps. She looked at her. She said, Ida. Ida said, Hattie. Hattie said, you come see me if you need to. Then she walked on. That was the whole conversation. Ida stood there holding both her children. And she thought, one. I have one. That is more than nothing. She walked the children home. Prudence sang softly to Buttons the whole way. Wesley did not speak. At the halfway point, he stopped and put his hand on his ribs, and coughed until Ida had to sit him down on a fallen log. She rubbed his back. She looked at the sky. She said, without looking at him, Wesley. Yes, Mama. You know Reverend Wickham was wrong today. Yes, Mama. You know that. Yes, Mama. He said it very small. She kissed the top of his head. She said, good, and they walked the rest of the way home. That afternoon, while the children napped, Ida moved Elias's chair. She had been meaning to for weeks. It sat by the hearth. It was heavy. She had not been able to bring herself to touch it, but she needed to sweep under it. She grabbed the chair by its arms and dragged it aside, and a floorboard bucked up under her foot. She stopped, bent down, pried at the board with her fingernails. Came loose easier than it should have, because it had been pried up before, because someone had lifted it and set it back down and not nailed it. Under the board was a leather notebook. Small, worn. Elias's. Ida sat down on the floor. She sat right there, cross-legged, the cold cabin planks under her skirt. She opened the notebook. His handwriting. She would have known it if she'd seen one letter of it on the far side of the moon. The first pages were sketches, contour lines, slopes, distances, the hillside behind their cabin. She recognized it from the shape. Then measurements, depths, widths, a rough drawing of an opening in the rock. Then temperatures, 50 degrees, 51, 50, 52. Next to each temperature was a date, some in January, some in March, some in July, some in the coldest week of last winter. The number barely moved. 50, 51, 50. Ida stared. She turned the page. More measurements. A crack in the ceiling that Elias had noted might function as a natural vent. A floor that Elias had described, in his tight, quiet handwriting, as dry and level enough to sleep. She turned another page. And another. She was breathing fast now. She didn't know why she was breathing fast. Yes, she did. She turned to the last written page. The last full page said this: "If the cabin fails, the hillside will not." Underneath, in a hand that looked rushed. Angrier. The pencil pressed harder. "Do not tell Blackwood." Underneath that, "If anything happens to me, this is here for you." Underneath that. Then a page had been torn out. The stub was still visible, rough at the edge. A page had been ripped clean out of her husband's private notebook, and the notebook had been hidden under a floorboard, and Elias was dead. Ida sat on the floor for a long time. She sat there until Prudence woke up. That night, after both children were asleep, Ida put on Elias's coat. She lit the lantern. She took the notebook. She took a hammer, matches, a length of twine, and a small thermometer she had bought at the general store 2 years ago for churning butter. She climbed the hill behind the cabin. The moon was 3/4. The pines were black. The frost cracked under her boots. She found the opening exactly where the notebook said it would be. Behind the brush. Behind a lip of limestone. She would have walked past it 10 times in daylight without seeing it. She dropped to her knees. She crawled inside. For 8 feet the ceiling was low, cold stone. She could hear her own breath. Then the passage opened. She stood up, held the lantern high. The chamber was bigger than she had expected. Pale limestone walls, dry leaves on part of the floor. No animal bones, no water stains running down. Nothing that said something else lived in here. She placed the thermometer on a flat stone. Then she stood very still and waited. The wind outside was around 32 degrees. The needle in the cave settled at 49. It moved once more. To 50. Then it stopped. Ida touched the wall. The stone was not warm. It didn't need to be warm. It was steady. Her father, in her memory on that porch in Massachusetts, was smiling at her. She heard him. "Don't ask what feels warm. Ask where the heat goes." Here, in this small stone room in the side of a Colorado mountain, the heat did not go. The heat stayed. She sat on the floor of the cave for an hour. She looked at the stone. She thought about the notebook. She thought about Elias, dead 8 months, torn page in his handwriting, hidden under a floorboard. She thought about Cyrus Blackwood, gentle as a preacher, offering to buy her out. She thought about Reverend Wickham saying pride from the pulpit. She thought about Wesley coughing. She thought about 45 degrees. And then she began to see things that were not there. She began to see a wall. Curved, built inside the cave mouth. A wall to break the incoming cold before it reached the sleeping chamber. She began to see a raised platform of stone, big enough for 2 children to sleep on, 18 inches off the floor, long enough for Prudence's whole small body, and Wesley's too. She began to see a firebox. Underneath. Not to heat the room, to heat the stone. Because you did not need to keep a fire burning all night. If you had heated the stone through, the stone would hold. The stone would give it back. Slowly. For hours. She began to see a channel for the smoke. Along the side of the platform. Out through a vent somewhere. Away from the sleeping children. She began to see it complete. She sat there in the cave and she saw it whole. And she thought, this will work. And then, right after, she thought, this might kill them. Because if she got the smoke channel wrong, they would die in their sleep. Because if she built the platform on a bad piece of stone, it would collapse under their weight. Because if she spent 5 weeks building this, and it didn't work, there would not be time to fix anything. Because if the town found out what she was doing, they would take the children from her. She sat with that, all of it, and then she picked up the notebook, held it in her lap, opened it to the last written page. If the cabin fails, the hillside will not. She read it 3 times. Then she said, out loud to no one in the empty stone room, where her husband had come and taken measurements and hidden a page, all right, Elias. Her voice sounded very small in the stone. All right. She went home. She did not sleep that night either. But it was a different kind of not sleeping. She began the next morning. She said nothing to the children. She fed them. She put Wesley to work sorting seed corn. Quiet work. At the table. Near the fire. She put Prudence beside him with a bowl of buttons, real ones, from the sewing tin, and told her to arrange them by color. Prudence took this very seriously. Wesley watched his mother put on Elias's coat. He said, where are you going, Mama? She said, up the hill. There's work. He said, what work? She said, work I'll tell you about when it's done. He looked at her. He was 8. He knew. He didn't ask again. He just said, I'll watch Prudence. She kissed him on the head, and she went. For 6 days she worked alone. Uphill by first light. Down by supper. She carried stones from the creek bed in a canvas sling across her shoulder. Some were small enough to fit under one arm. Some she had to roll. Her palms split by the second afternoon. She wrapped them in strips of an old flour sack. By the 4th day, her shoulders were bruised in a band across the top, where the sling sat. By the 5th day, she had built the first 3 feet of a curved wall inside the cave mouth. The wall was rough. She was not a mason. She was a woman with a sketch, a hammer, a bucket of clay, from the creek, and a father in her head telling her, level, plumb, patient. The wall started to look like a wall. She talked to Elias while she worked. Not out loud. Inside. You should have told me about this cave. You should have told me a lot of things. But I understand why you didn't. I don't forgive it. But I understand it. She kept building. On the 7th afternoon, she made a mistake. She came down the hill too early. The light was still good. The sun was still above the ridge. Which meant somebody could see her. Somebody did. Silas Grady was riding along the wagon track that skirted the base of her property. Silas was 61, a builder. He had put up half the cabins in this basin over the last 30 years. Roofs that stayed on. Chimneys that drew clean. Men trusted him. He had a face like a fence post, weathered, upright, without much give. He pulled his horse up. Mrs. Renshaw. Ida stopped walking. She had the empty canvas sling folded under her arm. She said, Mr. Grady, been up the hill? I have. What for? Work. What kind of work? Ida looked at him. She could have lied. She was tired of lying. She said, I'm building a room. Silas Grady blinked. Come again. I'm building a room in the cave. What cave? The one on the hillside. There's no cave on that hillside. There is. He looked at the hill. He looked at her. He said, slowly, Mrs. Renshaw, are you telling me you're building a room in a cave to live in this winter? I'm telling you I'm building a room in a cave to sleep in this winter. With the children. With the children. He stared at her. He looked her up and down. The bruise on her shoulder, visible where the coat had slipped. The bandages on her hands. The dust of limestone on her skirt. He shook his head. Mrs. Renshaw. Mr. Grady. That is the most foolish thing I have heard a grown woman say in 30 years of building houses in this valley. Is it? It is. Well. She waited. You gonna tell me to stop, Mr. Grady? He looked at her. Then he did something she did not expect. He laughed. Not cruel. Not exactly. Just a short surprised laugh. Like he was hearing a child announce plans to fly. Mrs. Renshaw, he said. You're gonna bury those babies in the side of a mountain, she said. I'm going to keep those babies alive in the side of a mountain. Same thing when they're dead. She said nothing. He said, Look, I got no ill will. I'll tell you what you need to do. Take Blackwood's offer. Get on the train. Get that boy to a doctor who knows what he's doing. This, he gestured at the hill, at her, at the whole ridiculous picture. This is a widow trying to prove something, Ida said. I'm not trying to prove something. Then what are you doing? I'm trying to make it to March. He looked at her. He didn't have an answer for that. He shook his head. He clucked to his horse. He rode on. By that evening, everyone at the trading post knew. By the next morning, everyone at the general store knew. By Sunday, the story had already grown teeth. The widow Renshaw was going to move her children into a hole in the ground like animals, and the town should really do something about it. Reverend Wickham did not sermonize again. He didn't need to. He was waiting. Ida kept building. She built through the second week of October. Through the frost that came at night now. Through Wesley's cough getting worse 3 days out of 7. She built. She had finished the curved entry wall. She had marked the platform. She had started collecting the flat creek stones for the sleeping surface. She was hauling one of these, a broad flat piece, about the size of a small table, awkward when a rider came up the wagon track. 2 riders, Cyrus Blackwood and Sheriff Halpern. Ida set the stone down. She wiped her hands on her skirt. She walked out to meet them. Sheriff Halpern was a decent man, or he had been once. He had been the sheriff of Silverpine for 11 years. He had a mustache and a limp and a wife who baked bread that Ida had once bought 2 loaves of. He would not look at Ida. That told her everything. Cyrus Blackwood dismounted. He was carrying a leather folder. Mrs. Renshaw. Mr. Blackwood. Sheriff Halpern is here as a witness. To what? To the delivery of these papers. He opened the folder. He drew out 3 sheets. Handwritten. Signed. Stamped with a seal Ida did not recognize. These are papers filed at the Territorial Mineral Claims Office in Denver, Cyrus said, gentle as ever. They demonstrate that your late husband, bless his memory, assigned partial mineral rights to a certain parcel to my company. The parcel in question is the west 40 acres of what you consider your land, including the hillside behind your cabin. Ida did not touch the papers. She said, That's a lie. Cyrus's face did not change. The signature is Elias Renshaw's, Mrs. Renshaw. Notarized. Dated November of last year. That's a lie. You are welcome to hire a lawyer and dispute it in Denver. Ida looked at Sheriff Halpern. He was looking at the ground. Sheriff, she said. He said, Ma'am, you believe this? He said, very quietly, It doesn't matter what I believe, ma'am. The paper's in order. Cyrus reached into the folder for one more sheet. This, he said, is a notice. You have 30 days to vacate the West 40, including the hillside. Ida did not take the paper. Cyrus placed it, very politely, on top of the flat creek stone she had set down. 30 days, Ida, he said. Or you can accept my earlier offer, which stands. Generously. He climbed back onto his horse. Sheriff Halpern turned his horse. They rode away. Ida stood beside the flat stone. The paper sat on top of it, ruffling in the wind. Wesley had come out onto the porch and he was watching her. She could not see his face from this distance. She could see his small shape. That was enough. She walked back inside. She held both children for a long time. Then, after Prudence had gone back to buttons, and Wesley had gone back to the seed corn, Ida sat down at the table. She opened the notebook. She turned to the last written page. Do not tell Blackwood, she thought. He already knew. He knew before Elias died. Which means Elias didn't fall. Which means someone made sure Elias fell. She did not have proof. She had a torn-out page, and a widow's certainty, which is not proof. But she knew, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her, if I run now, he wins twice. Once with the land, once with Elias. She closed the notebook. She looked at the hillside through the window. She said, out loud, to the empty room, 30 days. Then she said, all right. She stood up. She put on Elias's coat. She picked up the sling. And she went back up the hill to keep building. Because there was nothing else to do. Because everything else was surrender. And because somewhere under a cabin floorboard, her husband had left her a message that said, if the cabin fails, the hillside will not. She was going to hold him to that. Even from the grave. November came the way November comes to the Rockies. Not slow, not gentle. Came in one Tuesday morning, and it did not leave. Ida woke to find the water in the bucket by the door frozen through. Not a skin, not a crust, a block. She stood there in her nightgown looking at it. She thought, 18 days. 18 days until Cyrus Blackwood's notice ran out. 18 days to finish a stone room in the side of a mountain that she had never built before, using materials she had never worked with, alone, in a valley that was watching her fail. She put on Elias's coat. She went up the hill. The frost had hardened everything. The creek stones she needed for the sleeping platform were locked in ice at the shallows. She had to break them out with the hammer. Chips of frozen mud flew up and caught in her eyelashes. Her hands were bleeding again by 10 in the morning. She wrapped them, kept working, because there was no other thing to do, because time was not a resource anymore. Time was a wall closing in. Her fingers went numb by noon. Then they stopped being numb, which was worse. She sat down on a stump beside the cave mouth and put her hands under her arms and cried for exactly 1 minute. She timed it, 1 minute, then she got up, and she went back to work. Hattie Doyle came on Thursday. Ida did not hear her approach, which said something about how tired Ida was. Ida heard everything. Ida heard mice in the pantry. Ida heard Wesley cough 3 rooms away. But she did not hear Hattie's boots on the frozen leaves, until Hattie was standing right at the cave mouth. Ida! Ida turned. Hammer in one hand, bandage on the other. Hattie was carrying a stew pot. Real stew. Ida could smell it. Beef and onion and something with pepper. Hattie said, come out of there. You look terrible. Ida said, I've looked worse. When? I don't remember. Hattie stepped closer. She looked at the curved wall. She looked at the marks on the floor for the platform. She looked at the small firebox opening that Ida had begun to shape. She did not laugh. She did not gasp. She looked at it the way a farmer looks at another farmer's fence. She said, you built this. Ida said, I'm building it. By yourself. Yes. Under a floor of stone. Yes. With a fire. Yes. Hattie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, how's it work? Ida hesitated, because she had not said any of this out loud yet. Not to anyone. It had all lived inside her head, in her father's voice, in Elias's handwriting. She said, slowly, stone holds heat. I know that. Slow to warm, slow to cool. I know that too. So you don't have to keep the fire going all night. Hattie's eyebrows moved. You just heat the stone. That's it. And it holds. That's it. For how long? Ida said, I don't know yet. Hattie looked at her. You don't know. I haven't tested it. But you're going to sleep on it. With my children. Hattie set the stew pot down on a flat rock. She took off her gloves. She said, what needs doing? Ida stared at her. You believe me? Hattie said, "I believe December is coming." She said it flat. No music. No compliment. No pity. Ida almost cried again. She didn't. She picked up the sling. She said, "The stones for the platform. From the creek. I've been hauling them one at a time." Hattie said, "How many left?" "9." Hattie said, "Then we haul 9. They hauled 7 that afternoon. It got dark. Hattie went home. She said she'd be back Saturday. She came Saturday and Monday and Wednesday for the next 3 weeks. She was 68 years old, and she did not carry the big stones. She carried the small ones. She kept the fire in the cabin, so the children didn't freeze, while their mother was up the hill. She made bread. She fed Prudence. She did not ask Ida what would happen if the room didn't work. That was the thing about Hattie. She never asked the question you couldn't answer. Wesley figured it out on his own. Ida had known he would. He was 8 and he was watchful, and there was no way to hide that much stone dust on your skirt for that many days in a row. He came to her one evening when she was rebandaging her hands at the kitchen table. He sat down across from her. He said, "Mama." She said, "Wesley, I know where you go." She looked up. "I've known for a while." She said, "Since when?" "Since a week." "Did you follow me?" "Once." "How far in did you go?" "To the wall." She closed her eyes. She thought, "He's 8 and he crawled into a cave in the mountainside by himself." She thought, "I should scold him." She thought, "I can't." She said, "What did you think?" Wesley thought about that for a long time. He said, "I thought it was very cold." She said, "It is." He said, "But you're going to make it warm." She said, "I'm going to try." He looked at her hands, the bandages, the knuckles cracked and dark. He said very small, "Mama." She said, "Yes. Can I help?" She opened her mouth to say no. She looked at him. She looked at his shoulders, his narrow, careful 8-year-old shoulders, his father's shoulders in miniature. She said, "Yes." She said, "You can help me mix the clay." He nodded very seriously. The next morning he came with her up the hill. He carried a small tin bucket. He knelt beside the pit of creek mud and dry grass she was mixing for the mortar. He worked his little hands into it with the same care he gave to sorting seed corn. Ida watched him from the corner of her eye. He was not coughing today. She was not going to let herself think about why. Yet, but she thought about it that night. She thought about it in the cabin, in bed, with Prudence asleep beside her, and Wesley asleep on the other side of the room. She had noticed something. For 3 days now, Wesley coughed less when he was in the cave. She had noticed, and she had told herself she was making it up. Because the cave was still cold. Because she had not lit the firebox yet. Because there was no reason for it to make a difference. Except the air in the cave was not the same as the air in the cabin. The cabin air was full of wood smoke from a fireplace that leaked at the throat. It was full of dust from the loft. It was dry near the fire and damp near the walls, and it moved wrong. The cave air was still, even, cool, and Wesley coughed less. She wrote that down in the notebook, in the margin, in her own hand. Cave air quiet. Easier. She underlined it once. Then she blew out the lantern. The next visit from Silas Grady was different. He came on a Wednesday. He did not come on his horse. He came on foot, up the hill, following her tracks in the frost. Ida saw him from inside the cave. She was fitting a flat creek stone into the second course of the platform, and she looked up and saw a man's shape at the entrance, and her hand went to the hammer without her thinking. "Mrs. Renshaw." "Mr. Grady." He came in. He stood at the entry wall. He looked at it. He did not speak for a long time. He looked at the wall. Then he looked at the platform. Then he looked at the firebox opening. Then he looked at Ida. He said, "You built this. You already knew I was building it." "Yes." "So what are you here for?" He didn't answer right away. He walked around the platform slowly. He touched the top course of stones. He touched the vent channel Ida had begun to shape. He crouched down and put his eye to the firebox opening, the way a man checks a chimney. He stood up. He said, "Who taught you this?" Ida said, "My father. Your father did masonry. My father taught engineering." "Where?" "Massachusetts." "Where he taught you?" "Where I watched him." Silas looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He took his hat off. He turned it in his hands. He said, "Mrs. Renshaw." She waited. He said, "I owe you an apology." Ida did not answer. She was not going to make this easier for him. He said, "I laughed at you." "You did. In front of the trading post." "You did. I told 2 other men what a fool you were." "I know. I want to tell you why." Ida waited. He turned his hat in his hands again. He said, "My wife." Then he stopped. He did not go on for a while. Ida watched him. She had known Silas Grady for 4 years, and she had never once heard him say the word wife. He tried again. "My wife," he said. "Elspeth." He said the name like a man saying it out loud for the first time in a long time. Ida stayed very still. Silas said, 20 years ago. This valley. Winter of '64. He said, Elspeth wanted to build a stone room. Under our floor. Below the cabin. She had read about a thing they did in some part of Europe. She kept saying, "The ground holds heat, Silas, the ground holds heat." He said, "I told her it was foolish." He said, "I told her to keep to what she knew." He said, "I laughed at her." He stopped. He said, "She got sick in December of '64. Pneumonia. Our cabin, my cabin that I built, could not hold the heat. She got sicker. She died in February. She was 31 years old." Ida did not move. Silas turned his hat. He did not need to say the rest. Ida stood in the middle of the cave holding a hammer, and she looked at this 61-year-old man holding his hat in both hands, and she understood that he was not apologizing to her. He was apologizing to Elspeth. 20 years late. Through her. She let him have that. She said, "What can you do?" He said, "Whatever you need." She said, "The vent. Show me." She showed him. He looked at it. He touched the channel she had begun to carve. He asked her 3 questions. She answered them. He said, "You've done it right." She said, "I've never done it before." He said, "You've done it right." He came back the next day with a shovel and a length of iron rod, and he helped her cut a proper draft channel that ran the length of the platform and turned upward through a natural fissure in the ceiling. He did not talk while he worked. Neither did Ida. They were both, in different ways, working for people who were dead. The middle of November brought a new visitor. Ida was walking back to the cabin at dusk, when Wesley came running out to meet her. He was running. Wesley did not run. Wesley walked. Wesley moved carefully. Wesley conserved. Wesley was running. Ida caught him by the shoulders. She said, "What?" He said, "Mama." He said, "In the trees." He said, "I found." He held out his hand. In his palm was a stone chisel. Ida looked at it. Her stomach did a slow, cold turn. It was Elias's. The handle was worn smooth in the same places Elias's hand had worn it smooth. She would have known it out of 10,000 chisels. She said, "Where?" Wesley said, "In the pines." He pointed east. He pointed toward the ridge above the creek, where Elias had died, where the rockfall had been. Ida knelt down in front of him. She said, "Wesley, show me exactly." He nodded. He led her up the ridge. It was almost full dark now. He walked with the sure-footedness of a boy who had spent 8 months roaming this hillside without his father. He knew every rock, every root, every deer trail. He led her past the place where Elias was said to have died. He led her past it. He led her a 1/4 mile past it. He stopped. He said, "Here." Ida looked around. There was no rockfall here. There was no fresh scar in the hillside. There was no boulder that had come down and killed a man. There was a small clearing. Tarp had been there once. She could see the impression in the pine needles. Faint, but still visible under 8 months of weather. She saw scuff marks. She saw where something heavy had been dragged. She saw a piece of leather. Small, torn. The kind of leather a man might use to bind a tool roll. She picked it up. She turned it over. Stamped on the back. Small. Faded. She could just make it out. Renshaw. Ida sat down in the pine needles. Right there. She sat down. Wesley crouched beside her. He said, "Mama." She said, "Wesley." She said it in a voice she had not used since the day the 3 men came to the door with their hats off. She said, "Your father did not die where they said he died." Wesley said, "No." He said it flat. He had already known. He was 8 years old and he had known before she did. She looked at him. She looked at his small face in the last blue light. He said, "Mama, someone moved him." She said, "Yes." He said, "Was it Mr. Blackwood?" Her whole body went still. She said, "Why do you say that?" Wesley said, "Because Mr. Blackwood is the only person in this town who is always talking about your land." 8 years old. Watching. She reached out and pulled him against her. She held him for a long time. She said into his hair, so quiet that even the pines could not have heard it, "You will not tell anyone what you have shown me." He said, "No, Mama." She said, "Not Prudence." "No, Mama." She said, "Not Hattie." "No, Mama." She said, "Not until I say." He nodded against her collar. She stood up. She put the chisel and the leather scrap inside her coat, close to her ribs, where they would stay warm. She walked him back down the hill in the dark. She thought, "I do not have enough proof. Not for a sheriff who won't look at me. Not for a judge in Denver. I have a chisel and a torn strap and a scrape in the pine needles. That is not proof. That is a widow's knowledge." She thought, "But I know now. I know. And I am going to have to carry knowing. While I finish the room, while I keep the children fed, while I count the days on Cyrus Blackwood's notice. Because if I say a single word out loud right now, he will hear it. And he will move faster than I can." She thought, "Elias, I hear you. I am going to finish this. Then I am going to come for him. But not yet." She walked her son home in the dark, and she did not say any of it out loud. The town council notice came on Monday. It was delivered by Deputy Marsh, who was a young man with 2 clean boots and eyes that would not meet hers. He held out a folded sheet of paper. He said, "Mrs. Renshaw, from the council." Ida took the paper. She unfolded it. She read it once. She read it twice. She said, out loud without meaning to, "Oh." The paper was signed by Reverend Wickham and 3 members of the town council, 2 of whom had bought cattle from Cyrus Blackwood in the last year. The 3rd was Cyrus Blackwood's cousin. The paper said, "Because of concern for the welfare of the Renshaw children, because of the mother's known plans to house them in an unsafe subterranean structure, because of the mother's refusal of reasonable assistance offered by community members." The council had voted to convene a hearing on the 3rd Wednesday of December to determine whether Wesley Renshaw and Prudence Renshaw should be placed with a fit family in the town of Silverpine for their own protection. Signed, sealed, filed. The hearing was in 4 weeks, which was 3 weeks after Cyrus Blackwood's 30-day notice ran out. Ida stood on the porch in the cold with the paper in her hand. Deputy Marsh looked at his boots. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't like this either." She said, "That doesn't help me." He said, "I know." He got on his horse. He rode away. Ida stood on the porch for a long time. Then she walked inside. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put the paper down. She put her hands flat on either side of it. She thought, now they are coming for the children. Now, because they cannot buy the land. Because they cannot scare me off it. because they cannot get me to run. So now they are going to take the reason I am staying. She thought very calmly, I will not let that happen. I will die on this hillside first. That was not a metaphor. She meant it. She said it inside her chest once, clearly. She folded the paper. She put it in the same drawer as her mother's wedding ring. Then she stood up. She said to Wesley, "Get your coat." She said to Prudence, "Buttons too." She said, "We're going to try the room." That night was the test. Outside temperature, 22 degrees. Falling. Ida carried Prudence in her arms up the hill by lantern light. Prudence held Buttons tight against her chest. Wesley walked beside them carrying a canvas bag with blankets and a canteen and a small tin of soda crackers. Silas was already there. He had lit the lantern in the cave. He had checked the vent. He had, without being asked, brought a second thermometer. A better one. From his own shop. He did not say anything when they came in. He just tipped his head toward the platform, which he had, in the last 2 days, finished cladding with the flat creek stones. The top was smooth, slightly angled toward the low end for drainage. Even to the eye. Ida knelt at the firebox. Wesley knelt beside her. She said, "One match." He said, "One match." She struck it. Dry kindling caught. The flame leaned into the draft. The vent was pulling. She fed the fire carefully. Not a roaring fire. A small, patient, well-shaped fire. Papa's kind of fire. Silas watched. He did not offer advice. He watched. For 2 hours Ida tended it. The smoke traveled through the channel. Came out the vent. It did not enter the sleeping chamber. Not one wisp. Prudence sat up on the platform beside her mother, holding Buttons, watching the little firebox, with wide, serious eyes. Ida placed her palm on the stone. Warm. Not hot. Warm. She stopped feeding the fire. She let it die. The flames shrank, then went dark. The stone stayed warm. They laid the blankets on the platform. Ida tucked Prudence in first, Buttons on her chest, then Wesley beside her. She put her hand on his forehead. He was calm. His breath was moving in and out clean. He said, "Mama." She said, "Yes." He said, "It's warmer than home." She kissed his forehead. She sat up all night beside them, with the thermometer in her lap. At midnight, the outside temperature was 17 degrees. Inside the sleeping chamber at midnight, the thermometer read 53. At 3 in the morning, outside had fallen to 12. Inside was still 52. At 4 in the morning, for hours after the fire had died completely, the stone platform beneath the sleeping children was still warm to the touch. Wesley did not cough. Not once. All night, Ida sat there with her back against the cave wall. She looked at her sleeping children. And she cried without a sound. Just tears. Down her face. Into her collar. Silas Grady was sitting a few feet away against the other wall. He did not look at her. That was a kindness. He looked at the stone floor. He said, so quiet she almost missed it. Elspeth was right. Ida said, she was. He said, 20 years. Ida said, you're saying it now. He said, I am. They did not speak again until morning. They walked down the hill at dawn. The valley was still. Frost crackled under their boots. Prudence, half asleep in her mother's arms, said, Mama, is that hoot an owl? Ida said, it is. Prudence said, he's tired. Ida said, everybody's tired, sweetheart. Wesley walked ahead of them, straight, not coughing. He looked like a boy who had slept. At the cabin porch, Silas stopped. He said, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, yes, Mr. Grady. He said, you're going to want to move them into that room. She said, I know. He said, soon. She said, I know. He said, there's a storm coming. Ida looked at him. She said, how do you know? Silas Grady looked at the northern sky. Then he looked back at her. He said, because I've been building houses in this valley for 30 years. And when the wind changes at the end of November like that, it means the first big one is about a week out. And it's going to be bad. He said, I'd have everything you love in that room by Friday. Ida said, Friday. He said, Friday. He tipped his hat. He walked home. Ida stood on the porch with Prudence in her arms. She looked at the northern ridges. She looked at the sky above them. It was still only a pale gray sky. Not dramatic, not menacing, just a sky, but there was something wrong with the light. She had lived in this valley for 5 years, and she knew the light. Today the light was too flat, too even, like something up there was holding still, waiting. She thought, Friday. She thought, 5 days. She thought, to finish the vent, stock the wood, move the food, patch the entry wall, seal the smoke channel, split the last of the pine and get both my children up that hill. She thought, and I still have 22 days until the town takes them, from me on paper, and Cyrus Blackwood's notice runs out on the 17th. She thought, none of that matters if we don't make it through this first storm. She held Prudence tighter. The little girl was already going back to sleep against her mother's shoulder. Buttons, the rag doll, hung down the back of Ida's coat by one soft cotton arm. Ida stood on that cold porch with her sleeping daughter and her not yet coughing son, and she looked at the sky. She kissed Prudence on the temple. She said, out loud, to no one, all right. She said, Friday. She carried her daughter inside. Wesley was already at the fire, holding his palms out to it, standing very straight. Ida closed the cabin door behind them. Outside, the wind changed direction. Not much, just a little, just enough. Friday came. Ida woke before the light. She lay in bed for 1 minute. She listened to Wesley breathing across the room. She listened to Prudence beside her. She listened to the wind. The wind had changed again in the night. It was not gusting anymore. It was pressing. A long, steady, one-direction push from the north. Ida knew that push. Every woman who had ever lived on the west side of the Rockies knew that push. It meant a storm was standing on the ridges. Not moving, not talking, just standing there, getting ready. She got up. She dressed. She woke the children. She said, today we go. Wesley said, today. She said, today. Prudence said, with buttons? She said, with buttons. Prudence said, good. That was the whole conversation. They moved everything in 3 trips. Ida carried the heavy things. Hattie Doyle had come at dawn. She had known without being told, and she carried the medium things. Wesley carried the small things. Blankets, dried meat, flour, sugar, coffee, a tin of soda crackers, a jar of honey Hattie had brought, lamp oil, matches sealed in wax and rolled in oilcloth, 2 extra pairs of socks apiece, a wooden spoon, a knife, a pot, a cast iron skillet, Wesley's medicine, Elias's notebook. Ida carried the notebook inside her coat, against her ribs, the same way she carried the leather scrap and the chisel that Wesley had found in the pines. She carried them like a heart. She was not going to lose any of them. She was not going to lose any of them again. They had almost finished the 3rd trip when she saw the 2 men. They were at the woodpile, 2 men in dark coats. Neither of them was Cyrus Blackwood, but she knew who paid them. One of them had an axe. The other one had a small barrel. She could smell the barrel from 30 yards away. Kerosene. Ida stopped on the wagon track. Prudence was on her hip. Wesley was 2 steps behind her. She said very quietly without turning, Wesley. Yes, Mama. Take your sister. Yes, Mama. Go up the hill. Mama. Now. She handed Prudence to him. Prudence weighed almost as much as Wesley did. But he took her. Because he was 8 and he was his father's son, and he took her. He went. Ida did not watch him go. She walked toward the woodpile. The taller of the 2 men saw her coming. He said, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, get off my land. He smiled. She had seen that smile in the general store once. He said, Mr. Blackwood wanted us to remind you of the terms of your notice. She said, Which terms? He said, The ones where you vacate. She said, The notice runs until the 17th. He said, Today is the 15th. She said, The 17th. He said, Mr. Blackwood was concerned about your children in this weather. She said nothing. The shorter man opened the tap on the barrel. Kerosene poured onto the woodpile, onto her wood, her December, her January, her Wesley. She watched it soak in. She did not move. The taller man watched her face. He was waiting for her to scream. He was waiting for her to cry. He was waiting for a story he could take back and tell Cyrus. Ida did not give him one. She said, Are you finished? The taller man's smile flickered. He said, Mrs. Renshaw, we could. She said, Are you finished? The kerosene was empty. The shorter man tossed the barrel aside. The taller man reached for a match. Ida said, If you strike that match, you are murdering 3 children. He said, Nobody is murdering anybody, ma'am. She said, You will burn my house, my livestock, my smokehouse. He said, It's just the woodpile. She said, The wind is blowing toward the cabin. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the wind. It was. He hesitated. Ida said, You go back to Cyrus Blackwood and you tell him this. He waited. She said, You tell him I have moved my children out already. He blinked. He had not expected that. She said, You tell him he can burn an empty cabin, and an empty smokehouse, and a woodpile I no longer need, and he can enjoy the fire while the whole town watches him do it. She said, You tell him the sheriff is going to want to know why the widow Renshaw's cabin burned down 2 days before her notice expired. She said, You tell him he can strike the match himself if he wants to be the one holding it. The 2 men looked at each other. The taller man looked at the match in his hand. He looked at Ida. He looked at the wind. He put the match in his pocket. He said, Ma'am. She said, Get off my land. They got on their horses. They rode away. Ida stood beside the kerosene-soaked woodpile for 1 long minute. Then she turned around, and she went up the hill. Her legs were shaking. She did not let them show. Wesley and Prudence were waiting for her at the cave mouth. Prudence said, Mama, what were those men? Ida said, Bad men. Prudence said, Are they going away? Ida said, Yes. Prudence said, Good. That was Friday afternoon. By Friday night, the sky over the ridges was no longer gray. It was green, not everywhere, just at the edges, just at the seams where the clouds joined. A pale, sick green, the color of a bruise on someone who had been hit last week. Ida stood at the cave mouth and looked at it. Hattie stood next to her. Hattie said, I've seen that color once before. Ida said, When? Hattie said, 69. Ida said, How many died in 69? Hattie said, 21 people. Ida said, In this valley? Hattie said, In this valley. They stood there together. The wind pressed steady from the north. The pines below them were bending all one way. Hattie said, Ida. Ida said, Yes. Hattie said, I'm staying with you. Ida said, Hattie, your house. Hattie said, Is empty. There's an old woman and a cat. The cat can go under the stove. I'm staying with you. Ida looked at her. She said, Thank you. Hattie said, Don't thank me. Move over. Ida moved over. They both went inside. The first hard snow began at 9 that night. Not flakes, grains. Small, hard, sideways grains that hissed against the entry wall like sand. By 10, the wind had teeth. By 11, Ida could not see the cabin from the cave mouth. By midnight, she could not see 10 feet in front of her. Inside the cave, though, inside the cave, the fire under the platform was small and patient. The stone was warm. Prudence was asleep against Hattie's side. Wesley was on the other side of his sister, breathing clean, One small hand curled under his chin. Ida sat by the entry wall with the lantern. She watched the snow come. She thought, we made it in. She thought, everything I own, that I love is inside for stone walls I built, with my own hands. She thought, hold, stone. Please, hold. By dawn on Saturday there was no more outside. The world was white. The world was moving. The world had one sound, and it was the sound of a train that never arrived. Ida crawled out to the mouth of the cave once to check the vent from the outside. She did not make it 3 feet before she was blind. She could not tell up from down. The wind pushed her sideways. She crawled back in. Her eyelashes were frozen shut on the way. She sat with her back against the entry wall, and she thawed her face with her palms. Hattie said, well. Ida said, it's here. Hattie said, it is here. Prudence said, in her sleep. Buttons. Ida looked at her daughter. She said, Buttons is right there, sweetheart. She had not moved. The storm was still growing at noon. At 3 in the afternoon on Saturday, Ida heard something she was not expecting. A knock, on stone. Someone was knocking on the entry wall of a cave in the middle of a blizzard. Hattie went still. Wesley sat up. Ida stood. She picked up the hammer. She went to the entry wall. She said, loud enough to carry, through the wind. Who? A voice on the other side. Muffled. Cracking. Grady. Ida shoved the loose stones out of the wall's gap. Silas Grady fell into the cave. He was covered in ice. His beard was white. His eyebrows were white. There was blood on his forehead, where a branch had caught him. He looked like a man who had walked 2 miles through a wall of moving glass, because that was what he had done. He said, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, Mr. Grady. He said, just wanted to see if you needed anything. Ida looked at him. She started to laugh. She could not help it. Not the good kind of laugh. The other kind. The one that comes out when a thing is too much. Hattie said, Silas, you crazy old fool. Get by the platform. Silas said, yes, ma'am. He crawled over. He sat with his back against the warm stone. He held his hands out over the dying fire in the firebox. He said, Ida. Ida said, yes. Silas said, I'm not staying out there while a widow and 2 children ride out a killer. I told Elspeth I wouldn't. Ida said, Elspeth is not out there. Silas said, I know exactly where Elspeth is. His voice broke on it. He did not look at Ida when he said it. Ida sat down next to him. She did not touch him. She just sat there. The stone was warm under both of them. He said after a while, you did it right, Ida. She said, the stone did it. He said, you put the stone right. Saturday night, the second problem started. Ida did not notice it right away. She noticed the lantern flame first. The lantern flame was straight. The lantern flame had been leaning all night toward the vent, because the vent was drawing, because the vent was pulling smoke and used air up and out of the mountain. Now the flame was straight, which meant the vent was not drawing, which meant something above them had blocked it, which meant if she lit the firebox now, the smoke would come backward, into the sleeping chamber, over her children. Ida stood up slowly. She did not say anything to the children. Prudence was asleep. Wesley was mostly asleep. She went to the lantern. She held it under the vent. The flame did not move. She said, Hattie. Hattie was already looking. Hattie said, how bad? Ida said, the snow's over it. Hattie said, how much snow? Ida said, it's been coming down 20 hours. Hattie said, so a lot. Ida said, so a lot. Silas said, Ida. Ida said, yes. Silas said, you can't light the firebox. Ida said, I know. Silas said, the stone will hold heat for another 6, maybe 8 hours. After that, Ida said, I know that too. Silas said, how many hours has the storm been going? Ida said, 20. Silas said, how much longer will it go? Ida said, I don't know. Silas said, so we have 8 hours to clear a vent buried under something we can't see, in a storm that will kill us the moment we step out of the cave. Ida said, yes. Silas said, all right. He said it very calmly. He said it the way a builder says all right when he has looked at a bad wall and understood it. He said, then we don't step out. Ida said, then how? Silas said, through the ceiling. The vent ran up, through a natural fissure in the cave ceiling. They could not see the top of the fissure from inside, but they could reach into it. Silas took off his coat. He took off his shirt. He wrapped his hands and his forearms in strips torn from his shirt. He climbed onto the platform. Prudence was still asleep. He was careful. He reached up into the fissure. He said, cold. Ida said, snow. He said, compacted. He began to dig with his hands above his head. Snow came down onto his face. He turned his face away and kept digging. The snow packed against his shoulder. He shook it off. He dug again. An hour later he stopped. He said, Ida. She said, yes. He said, I'm too old. He said it flat, not self-pitying, just information. He said, I've got another 20 minutes in me. Then my arms are going to give and I'll fall. Ida looked at him. She said, come down. He came down. She climbed up. She wrapped her own hands. She reached up into the fissure. She dug. The snow was hard. It was not soft powdery snow. It was wind-packed, weight-packed, hour-packed snow. She dug. Her arms burned. Her shoulders burned. Her fingers went past cold, past numb, into the strange place where you cannot feel them, but you know they are still moving because you can see them. She dug. She thought about Wesley. She thought about Prudence. She thought about her father, who used to say, the only thing between you and dying most days is one small thing done in time. She dug. She hit air. She did not hit air right away. First she hit less packed snow, then thinner snow, then, at the tips of her fingers, above her head, above her exhausted arms, she felt a shift. She felt cold air moving. She had punched through. She kept working. She made the hole bigger and bigger. She came down. She was shaking. She could not stand. Silas caught her before she fell off the platform. Hattie said, look. They looked at the lantern. The flame was leaning. The vent was drawing again. Ida sat on the floor and cried for 1 minute. She timed it. 1 minute. Then she stopped. Silas said, fire. Ida said, small one. He lit it. The smoke traveled through the channel. It went up. It went out. Nothing came back into the room. The stone under the sleeping children began, slowly, to warm again. Sunday morning. The storm had not broken, but the wind had shifted a quarter turn to the west, which, Silas said, meant it was thinking about ending. Not soon, but thinking. Ida sat by the entry wall. She had not slept in 30 hours. Her hands were bandaged in strips of her own petticoat. Her eyes were sore. She heard a knock again. This one was smaller. This one was weaker. She looked at Hattie. Hattie looked back. Ida went to the entry wall. She said, who? A voice on the other side. Barely there. Wickham. Ida did not move. The voice said, my family. My wife. My children. The voice said, the church roof. The voice said, please. Silas was already beside her. He whispered, how many? Ida whispered back, 5. Silas whispered, there's room. Ida did not move for a long time. Reverend Wickham on the other side of the wall. Reverend Wickham who had preached against her, from the pulpit. Reverend Wickham who had signed the notice to take her children. Reverend Wickham with his wife. Reverend Wickham with his 3 children. Freezing. Ida thought, if I open this wall, I let in the man who tried to take Wesley and Prudence. She thought, if I don't open this wall, 5 people die outside my door. She thought, if I don't open this wall, one of the dead people is a child. She thought, if I don't open this wall, I am the person he said I was. She reached for the loose stones. Silas said, Ida. She said, I know. She said, move. She pulled the stones out. Reverend Wickham fell through the gap. Then his wife. Then his 3 children, one at a time, small and shaking. The youngest was 4 years old. He was blue at the lips. Ida picked him up. Without a word. She carried him to the warm platform. She set him next to Prudence. She wrapped him in her own blanket. She rubbed his feet with her raw hands until he began to whimper. Then, and only then, she looked at Reverend Wickham. He was on his knees on the cave floor. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his son. Ida said, Reverend. He said, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, you will stay by the entry wall until I say otherwise. He said, yes, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, you will not speak to my son. He said, no, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, you will not speak to my daughter. He said, no, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, you will not preach in this room. He said, no, Mrs. Renshaw. Then he put his face in his hands. He did not cry loud. He cried the way a man cries when he has understood something he does not want to have understood. Ida left him there. She went back to the little blue-lipped boy on the warm stone. She rubbed his feet until they were pink. The storm broke on Tuesday morning. Not clean. Not with sunrise. It broke the way old ice breaks. In pieces. With cracks. With 1 hour of stillness followed by another gust. And then another. But by Tuesday afternoon, Ida could see the shape of the ridge across the valley. She had not seen the shape of the ridge across the valley in 4 days. She stood at the cave mouth. The valley below was unrecognizable. Roofs were gone. Fences were gone. The Renshaw cabin was buried to the eaves. She could see one thin line of smoke coming from somewhere down by the trading post. Maybe 2. She could not see the Blackwood ranch from here. But she could see something else. There was a horse standing on the wagon road below. Alive. Riderless. Saddled. The saddle was worked with silver at the horn. Ida stared at that horse for a long time. Then she went back inside the cave. She sat down next to Silas. She said, Silas. He said, yes. She said, Cyrus Blackwood's horse is standing in the road. He said, alone. She said, alone. He looked at her. She said, the horse is fine. He said, the rider isn't. She said, the rider isn't. They found Cyrus Blackwood the next day. He was in the Renshaw cabin. He had made it inside before the roof went. Sheriff Halpern was the one who told her. He came up the hill on foot, slowly, hat off, and he stood at the cave mouth, and he waited for her to come out. She came out. He said, Mrs. Renshaw. She said, Sheriff. He said, Mr. Blackwood is dead. She said, how? He said, froze. He said, in your cabin. He said, there was no wood. He said, there was kerosene on what was left of the woodpile. He said, the stove hadn't been lit. He said, he tried to break up a chair, but the roof came down before he got it going. Ida looked at him. She said, why was Mr. Blackwood in my cabin, Sheriff? Sheriff Halpern looked at his boots. He said, I don't know, Mrs. Renshaw. He said, I have some ideas. He said, none of them are good. Ida said nothing. Sheriff Halpern said, I owe you an apology. Ida said, you do. He said, I signed the notice. She said, you did. He said, I knew the papers weren't right. She said, I know. He said, I was afraid of him. She said, a lot of people were. He said, that is not an excuse. She said, no. He said, no. He took a folded piece of paper out of his coat. He held it out to her. He said, This is the original notice, and Blackwood's mineral claim papers, and the affidavit he had me witness. She said, "Why are you giving me these?" He said, "So you can burn them if you want." She looked at him. She said, "Sheriff." He said, "Yes." She said, "I don't want to burn them." He said, "No." She said, "I want you to file them as evidence in Denver against his estate." She said, "There is going to be an inquest into how a man ended up frozen in my cabin 2 days before he tried to take my land." She said, "You are going to be the one who files it." Sheriff Halpern held her look for a long moment. Then he nodded. He said, "Yes, Mrs. Renshaw." He rode away. Spring came slowly. That was the thing about the Rockies. Spring did not arrive. Spring negotiated. Took March. Took most of April. It took the low snow first, and then the mid-snow, and finally, in the last week of April, the high snow began to give. On the 2nd of May, a boy from the Patterson place came running up the wagon road. He was breathing hard. He said, "Mrs. Renshaw." She said, "Yes." He said, "In the pines, above the ridge, above where they found." He stopped. He did not know how to say it. Ida said it for him. She said, "Above where they said they found my husband." He nodded. He said, "Ma'am, there's bones." Elias's remains were 2 miles north of where the town had buried an empty box 8 months before. He was under the roots of a fallen fir that had come down in the storm. The tree had covered him. The tree had also uncovered him when it fell. Beside him was a leather satchel. Inside the satchel was a stone chisel, a match to the one Wesley had found in the pines. Inside the satchel was a second, larger notebook. The notebook was water-warped, but it was readable. It contained a full survey of a small silver vein on Renshaw land. It contained 3 pages of dated notes about a series of confrontations with Cyrus Blackwood. The last dated entry was from January of 1884. Said this, "Blackwood came to the cabin today when Ida was in town. He offered to buy the claim. I said no. He said I would change my mind. He said the mountain was a dangerous place for a man with a family. Meet him tomorrow at the ridge to hear his final offer. Will not go alone. Will not tell Ida yet. Do not want her frightened." There was no next entry. Sheriff Halpern read the notebook out loud in the Silverpine church. He read it standing up. He read it to a full room. He read it while Ida sat in the front row, holding both her children, with buttons on Prudence's lap. When he was finished, he closed the notebook. He said, "Cyrus Blackwood killed Elias Renshaw." He said, "I signed papers I knew were wrong." He said, "I resign, effective today." Then he sat down. Reverend Wickham was in the pew across the aisle. He was looking at his own hands. He did not stand up to preach. He never stood up to preach again. 2 months later, he wrote a letter of resignation to the diocese and moved his family east. He wrote one more letter, to Ida. She read it once. She did not answer it. She did not burn it either. She put it in the drawer with her mother's wedding ring. Some things you did not have to forgive. You just had to not carry them. The years moved. Silas Grady lived 12 more winters. He rebuilt his own cabin the summer after the storm. He built it with a stone floor and a heat channel underneath and a smoke channel that turned twice before it left the chimney. He never called it Elspeth's design out loud. He didn't have to. He built a lot of houses in the valley in those 12 years, and every one of them held heat. Hattie Doyle moved into the Renshaw cabin when she got too old to live alone. She lived there another 9 years. She died in her sleep in a bed 6 feet from the front door. Wesley Renshaw grew tall. His lungs never fully cleared, but they never got worse either. He became a stonemason. He worked in Silverpine for a while, then in Denver, then all through Colorado and up into Wyoming. They started calling his kind of work Renshaw stone. He didn't ask them to. They just did. Prudence Renshaw learned to read at 7 and taught school at 19 and married a schoolteacher from Boulder at 23. She kept buttons on the top of her bookshelf her whole life. When her granddaughter was 6 years old, she gave buttons to her. She said, "This doll survived a very bad winter." The granddaughter said, "Was Grandma there?" Prudence said, "Grandma made the room." Ida Renshaw lived to be 87. She never left the Silverpine Basin. She never remarried. She did not need to. She was buried at her own request, next to Elias on the ridge above the creek. On the stone, at her own instruction, they carved 4 lines. Ida Renshaw, 1852 to 1939. Don't ask what feels warm. Ask where the heat goes. The stone room in the hillside is still there. The town called it the Renshaw Room for a while. Then, later, when people forgot the whole story except the shape of it, they called it the widow's room. Then, later still, they just called it the room. Children in the valley grow up hearing about it. Their grandmothers tell them. There was a widow, the grandmothers say. Her husband was killed. Her son was sick. The whole town laughed at her. The whole town told her she was foolish. The whole town wanted her gone. And she built a room in the side of a mountain. And when the storm came, she opened the door to everyone, including the ones who had laughed. And the stone she laid with her own hands, held